Welcome back. In this session, we're focusing on something that shows up in every setting and every theoretical orientation: ethics in real practice. Ethics isn't just about avoiding complaints or not getting in trouble, it's about consistently making choices that protect clients, strengthen trust, and support effective care, especially when the situation is messy, ambiguous, or emotionally charged. As you listen or watch through this video, keep one guiding questions in mind. If I were seeing this client tomorrow, what would ethical practice look like step by step? Let me see. Okay. By the end of this chapter, you should be able to describe mandatory, aspirational, and positive ethics and identify the characteristics and steps of ethical decision making. You'll also be able to explain informed consent forms and describe the major dimensions of confidentiality, privacy, privileged communication, and exceptions. When you hear ethics, what's the first topic you think of? Just take a pause and think about it. Is it confidentiality? Is it boundaries? Is it mandated reporting, documentation, or something else? A colleague of mine who is a social worker, I happened to run into that individual when I was inviting for a guest speaking. She mentioned that one of the important skills that the new therapist should hone early on is reporting, because that becomes extremely important skill no matter which setting you work in, right? And you'll also look at ethics through a multicultural lenses and what it means to modify techniques with diverse clients. Then you'll also address key ethical issues in assessment and diagnosis, including how culture influences both. Think of your cultural background and when you are about to make a diagnosis. Do you hesitate? Is it because the ambiguity of symptoms, or is it your culture influence in labeling somebody with diagnosis? So take this reflective pause. Think about the time you saw a cultural mismatch creating misunderstanding. How might that become an ethical issue in therapy? And finally, we'll compare arguments for and against evidence-based practice and cover ethical issues in multiple relationships, including the difference between boundary crossing and boundary violation, and how to manage boundaries and risk with social media. We'll end with what it means to become an ethical counselor over time. Ethical principles aren't an extra topic in counseling. They're woven into everyday decisions, balancing clients' needs against your own needs, making sound decisions under pressure, educating clients about their rights, and clarifying confidentiality. A helpful way to frame this chapter is ethical practice is active practice. It requires attention, it requires reflection, right? Consultation and documentation, especially when you are unsure. Let's ground ourselves in 3 categories of ethics. This may be somewhat vague, but it helps you to look at mandatory ethics, the minimal standards, which means you're just doing bare minimum to stay out of trouble. What you must do though. Aspirational ethics would be the highest standards, what you strive to do at your best. Rather than staying away from trouble, you're inspired to do or bring the most for your client. Positive ethics and approach focus on doing your best for clients, not simply meeting minimum requirements. Now, you might see that aspirational ethics and positive ethics are similar. They are. And all of them, what you see common is you must do bare minimum, but beyond that, how far do you go? Do you just involve the highest standards of thinking and conduct, or do you practice to bring the best for your client? Mandatory ethics, for example, might mean you follow confidentiality rules. Aspirational ethics might mean you anticipate risk, educate clients thoroughly, and visit consent over time. Positive ethics means you're proactively thinking, how do I serve this client well, not just legally? Hopefully that helps you to differentiate. Here's a question for you. Putting clients' need before your own. Now we move into a foundational ethical stance. Professional relationship exists for the benefit of the client. This sounds obvious until you realize how often our personal needs can subtly shape our behavior in session. All right? Ethical practice requires awareness of your own needs, sometimes unfinished business, potential personal problems, and especially sources of countertransference that we talked in previous meeting or video. This isn't self-criticism, it's responsibility. If I'm using the client to meet my need for feel competent, needed, or admired, I may steer therapy toward my comfort rather than the client's growth. It becomes easier as you practice more. Most of the time, when client asks you questions, is it about you or is it about them? Right? You constantly take a pause and you might need to reflect. A client is angry at you, for example. If you have a strong need to be liked, you often soften, reassure, or over-explain rather than exploring the rapture. That's not just the clinical issue, it's an ethical one because it can block the client's work. Again, take a pause when somebody is angry at you, depending on how you appraise that experience, right? That anger, how do you appraise it? That will reflect how you would respond to those situations. Again, here's another reflective question for you. What personal need might you be most vulnerable to in counseling? Control, approval, rescuing, certainty. Take a moment and think about it. When dilemmas happen, and they will, ethics code won't solve them for you. You still have to think, consult, and choose. So, ethics codes matter because they outline professional standards and responsible practice. But codes do not make decisions for us, for counselors. Our job is to interpret and apply ethical practice to the specific situations in front of us. Again, codes are guardrails, not autopilot. Ethical decision making. The principle underneath professional ethics codes include benefit others, do not harm or do no harm, respect autonomy, be just, fair, and faithful. Faithful to the codes, faithful to the profession, rather than the religious aspect. Ethical codes educate us, create accountability, improve practice, and protect client. Here's an example. A client wants you to write a letter that exaggerates symptoms for a benefit claim. The decision isn't just what does the client want, it's also harm, fairness, integrity, and long-term client welfare. If you are in that position, you will definitely look at what would be the process that I need to go through to make decision, right? Here's a practical, repeatable decision-making model, right? Identify the problem, review relevant ethical codes and laws. In California, you have American Association of MFT, California Association of MFT, American Association of MFT. So if you are, I'm referring to my field, I'm in the marriage and family therapist. So if you think of those, if you're in psychologist, then you have a separate code of conduct or codes given by APA, American Psychological Association. So those will provide you codes and laws. Seek consultation. When you don't know how to interpret those codes, talk to supervisor, talk to colleagues, brainstorm possible actions. Again, supervisors or colleagues that I have consulted with, they will, if they are in a good mindset, people, those who are really helpful, they will not decide for you. They will interpret, they will give their perspective. At the end of the day, you are the one who's going to make these decisions. So brainstorm possible actions. List likely consequences, as simple as make it two pros and cons, right? Pros and cons of your decision. And you just check how many of them are good, how many of them are bad. weigh the decisions, decide. And the biggest part is document. Document. You must document your clinical judgment, clinical decision making process. That will be lifesaver if there is something to go south. For example, if your client is sharing about suicidal ideation, thinking about harm to others, but you are ambiguous, you're not sure whether you should report or not, all those thought process should be reported, should be documented. So it will be helpful if any kind of repercussion to happen, you have evidence to share. Again, in real practice, the two steps people skip are consultation and documentation, right? Those two steps protect client and protect you. Consulting help you to have different pairs of eyes, different pairs of, ears who will give different perspective. Documentation will protect you from any future potential danger. With that, I take a pause because sometimes my subtitle is still showing up. But let me ask you another question here. Informed consent is not a one-time form. It's a relationship practice. It's how we respect client autonomy and build trust. Informed consent means giving clients information needed to make informed choices, educating them about rights and responsibilities, empowering them and building trust, addressing privacy issues, including the implication of using technology. When I was a practitioner, we had to record the session and we have to reveal. We're using the video recording. We're also going to use that videotape for practice purposes. If client is declining, you will respect that. And nowadays, the telehealth, if you're doing a session on the Zoom, you must reveal what kind of platform you're using, what kind of information will be stored, and what would be those information used for, right? So practical phrase you can use is, I want you to know what to expect, what your options are, and what your rights are, to keep it simple, so you can decide if this feels like a good fit. So that's very important to communicate. The rights of informed consent, key elements to cover here is procedures and goals. What kind of therapy technique you use? How many sessions do you anticipate? Client responsibilities in terms of fee, in terms of showing up, cancellation, all those process. Limits and expectations to confidentiality. We'll talk about that in a minute. Legal and ethical parameters, qualifications. Do you have a master's? Do you have a PhD? Are you licensed? Are you a practicum? Are you an intern? Those information. Approximate length of the process. What time do you start? What time do you end? What if the client needs to continue beyond the time? What is the protocol to terminate the session? All those. Again, here's a quick scenario. My client says, so are you going to tell anyone what I say? A strong informed consent response is common. Specific. Most of what you shared stays private. There are a few important exceptions, like danger to self or others, abuse reporting for elderly individuals or minors, or a court order. Outside of these, whatever you talk to me, whatever you share in these sessions will be private, will be protected by privileged communication, right? So let me take a pause and ask you another question. Confidentiality is one of the strongest trust builders in therapy, and also one of the most misunderstood. Let's dive in. Confidentiality is essential but not absolute. Also, notice the difference between confidentiality versus privileged communication. Confidentiality is an ethical duty not to disclose client information. Privileged communication, on the other hand, is a legal concept that can protect client communications from disclosure in legal proceedings. What does this mean in practice? You don't promise I'll never tell. You promise you will protect privacy within legal and ethical limits, and you will explain those limits. Now, if you look at dimensions of confidentiality, technology complicates confidentiality and privacy. When technology is involved, email, texting, telehealth platform, social media, that risks change. Ethically, you must address these risks in the informed consent process and practice in a way that protect client privacy as much as possible. Okay? If a client wants to text sensitive details, you might say, texting isn't fully private. Let's use it only for scheduling and keep client details for sessions on a secure method. Major exceptions include, again, in exceptions wise, major exceptions include danger to self or others. If client were to share this intentionally, sometimes unintentionally, the information comes out and you have reasonable doubt to believe what client share is true, then it is not anymore confidential. It is not anymore protected under privileged communication, right? It's not protected. Why? It is now beyond that privileged communication, danger to self or others. Again, it's not just because they happen to say, I'm feeling low, I don't think I want to live, is not enough. You rather explore more. You ask follow-up questions, lethality. Do they have a plan? Do they have a time set? What are some other preparation or readiness they have done? So you inquire more when they reveal about suicidal ideation or harm to others. Simply making a simple blanket statement does not lead to breaching. You do have to, again, that's why documentation is very important and your follow-up questions are very important. And that's where you explain, danger to self or others, abuse of children or minors, dependent adults or older adults, need for hospitalization because the client is unable to make any decisions. Court actions when information become an issue. Again, it's court order, subpoena, not just a police warrant. It should be court-issued order. Client requests release of records. If client asks you to reveal, again, that is where it is not anymore protected. Now, you don't wait until a crisis to explain this. That's why you have to set the boundary on the first day. You explain them, let them ask, make sure your client is fully aware of what is protected and what is not. Because later they might say, I did not know. You rather have them already established and make them aware of the limitations, right? Ethical practice is preparing client early on, right? Let me ask you another question here. Now we widen the frame. Ethics isn't culture free. What counts as healthy, appropriate, or resistant can shift depending on worldview and context. Ethical issues from a multicultural perspective, current theories can and need to be expanded to include a cultural perspective. Some assumptions about mental health, developmental, and effective treatment may have little relevance for some clients. This is why an interactive person in the environment focus matter. For example, if a client is constrained by discrimination, poverty, or immigration stress, it can be unethical to treat the distress as purely individual pathology without acknowledging environment. Think of the current, at least the time that I'm making this video, all the incidents across the country, the presence of the ICE agents, the change in the status, change in the funding for LGBTQ community, all these changes is not anymore individual psychopathology. It is social oppression. It is social change in structure, political, socio-political aspect affecting their well-being. So be mindful of those changes, right? To practice ethically and effectively, a counselor must be mindful of diversity and social justice issues. Sometimes the work involves facilitating social action and community change, not merely increasing individual insights. That's why when you pursue path of marriage and family therapist or social worker, you have to engage in community mental health, the class that I'm teaching for graduate course, which allows you to think from non-medical model, client advocacy, case management, supporting client outside of the therapy room. And here's one reflective prompt for you. If you're setting, what's one environment factor that you need to keep in view? Is it housing, safety, stigma, access to care, language barriers? Those are important aspects that you should be mindful of. Assessment and diagnosis can help treatment planning, but they also come with ethical risk. Assessment is an ongoing process to evaluate key aspects of functioning. It's influenced by theoretical orientation, requires cultural sensitivity, and can be helpful for treatment planning. Assessment should clarify, not reduce, what the client is, who the client is. And if you were to think from more ethical point of view, include client in your assessment rather than using expert's lens, which will allow you to fully understand the client's struggle and develop more effective treatment plan. The other term here is diagnosis. Diagnosis involves identifying a pattern of symptoms that fits criteria for a disorder. This is very medical model. It's required for the billing purposes, insurance purposes, communication purposes. It also requires cultural sensitivity. Now, if we take a moment and debate whether diagnosis is necessary, some people say yes, some people say no. For example, postmodern approach most of the time oppose diagnosis, but it can help planning. If you have a diagnosis, it helps to communicate among professions, right? It can also help to bill and receive funding for insurance through insurance. So it has some use, but also sometimes you might need to be mindful of people, those who have strong stigma. Stigma could be very dangerous, prevent people from seeking treatment. And using diagnosis could worsen the stigma around mental health. So there are ethical dilemmas around diagnosis. For example, the clinician feels pressure to assign a diagnosis quickly for reimbursement, even when information is incomplete. This is probably on early first 2 sessions. Ethical decision making here means assessment integrity, consultations as needed, and transparency with the client, rather than rushing through labeling or giving a diagnosis so you can reimburse versus like what is the best course of action, going back to ethical decision making. Let me ask you a question here. Next is evidence-based practice, often shortened to EBP. This topic can become polarizing, so we'll hold a balanced view. Okay. Evidence-based practice involves treatments validated by empirical research, often brief and standardized. These approaches are preferred by many insurance companies and are intended to enhance effectiveness and improve public health. In practical reality, in many settings, you will be asked to justify your interventions, measure outcomes, and demonstrate effectiveness. The ethical concerns that could include in evidence practice could be approaches can become mechanic and may not fully consider relational dimensions or individual variability. For example, the evidence comes from a certain population or certain ethnic group, certain socioeconomic status that may not fit well with the population that you're working with. Some human concerns like existential meaning, which is not very easy to find evidence for or against, may not fit diagnostic criteria neatly, right? How do you balance it? Use research-informed interventions while still tailoring to the client's identity, preferences, culture, and relationship dynamics. That will help you to not completely ignore the ethical aspect, but also include science-based, evidence-based techniques to make more effective interventions. Now we move to one of the most common and most anxiety-provoking ethical area, multiple relationships and boundaries. Multiple relationships occur when counselors assume roles subsequently with a client. Sometimes it could be sexual or non-sexual. The term multiple relationship often replaces dual relationship because it captures complexity. Non-professional interactions can pose challenges and increase risk. For example, in a small community, you might see client at the grocery store, a school event, or a place of worship. The ethical task is to anticipate risk running into client in those settings, clarify boundaries early on, make sure you tell client, if I see you in the store, let's not start another session. If you're comfortable to greet and show that courtesy of knowing each other, cool with that, but avoid any kind of an in-depth conversation. So establish that boundaries when you share informed consent and avoid harm, right? You don't want to ignore, or you don't want to overly involve in those situations. And managing roles, managing multiple relationship, well, multiple roles can include teacher, therapist, supervisor, therapist, and many other combinations. Ethics requires careful management of boundaries, boundary issues, and responsibilities. It does not deny that they exist. In other term, you are not required to have only therapy client relationship. There are some healthy boundary crossing that could benefit client. Not necessarily all multiple relationship or dual relationships are harmful or must avoid it. That is not the case. If you're unsure whether something is a boundary problem, that uncertainty is your cue to consult, right? Now, social media adds another layer of boundary risk. Confidentiality, privacy, and unintended multiple relationship. Best practice includes limiting what you share online, includes social networking policies in informed consent, and regulating updating privacy settings because the rule change. For example, if a client sends a friend request, you can respond clinically without shaming. I don't accept friend requests because it can affect your privacy and our therapeutic boundaries. We can talk about what it was like to send it and what you needed in that moment. Now, it's like a little technical response, but you can bring that topic as a discussion in the next meeting so you explain that how you're protecting yourself and protecting your client. And the other suggestion is have separate media platform rather than using the same platform for personal and professional users. Becoming an ethical counselor involves knowing and following your professional ethic codes, interpreting guidelines, and applying them to specific situations, seeking consultation, staying open, and self-reflective. Ethical decision making is evolutionary, right? You don't arrive, you practice it again and again. Let me ask you a question here. Yeah. Again, just to consolidate what we went over in these last few slides, it's ethics include mandatory aspiration positive effects, put client welfare first by monitoring your own needs and reactions, use a structured ethical decision-making process, and document your reasoning. It's very important. Consulting, documentation. Informed consent is ongoing and includes technology-related privacy. Confidentiality is essential, but not absolute. Know the exceptions. Practice ethically, multiple cultural awareness, and a person in environment view. Approach assessment diagnosis with cultural sensitivity and careful judgment. Hold evidence-based practice with balance. Use research while honoring relationship and individuality. Manage multiple relationship and social media boundaries proactively. Those are some takeaway if you look at the entire slide deck we went over. As we finish, revisit the objective in the slide and think about how these ethical practices, ethical norms come into life when you are in a therapy session, when you are working with clients. I'll see you in next lecture.